The auction house was alive with murmurs, the scent of hay and polished wood mingling with the sharp tang of anticipation. Rows of wealthy buyers sat in their tailored suits and gleaming boots, their expressions cold and calculating as they assessed each horse brought onto the platform. These were people who lived by numbers, pedigrees, training records, and performance statistics. For them, this was a science, a careful balance of risk and reward. And then there was him, a man who didn't belong. Dressed in worn clothes that had seen better days, he stood near the back, shifting uneasily as he gripped the rolled-up bills in his hand. Every dollar had been earned the hard way, long hours in the fields, blistered hands, and aching muscles. He wasn't here for show. He wasn't here to make a name for himself. He was here because he needed a horse. His farm had suffered. The last storm had taken down half his fencing, and his old workhorse, his only horse, had gone lame. He didn't have the luxury of waiting for another year's harvest to recover. If he didn't get a strong horse today, he might as well start packing up and leaving the land his family had worked for generations. But these auctions weren't meant for men like him. The bids being thrown around were absurd. Thousands, tens of thousands. He swallowed hard as another sleek, muscled stallion was paraded onto the platform, its hooves striking the wooden floor like the drum of a marching army. The auctioneer's voice was rapid, almost hypnotic, as the numbers climbed higher and higher. There was no chance. Not for him. And then something changed. A commotion stirred near the holding area. A couple of handlers struggled to bring out the next horse, their grips firm on the rope as the animal resisted. The crowd chuckled as the creature stepped into view, a mess of a horse, wild-eyed and unkempt, its coat muddied, its ribs faintly visible beneath its hide. The laughter rippled through the audience. This was a joke. The auctioneer barely masked his disdain as he started the bidding low, almost as if he was embarrassed to waste time on this one. The buyers scoffed. They had come for champions, not for whatever this was. And yet, the farmer's eyes locked onto the horse, something stirring deep in his chest. There was fight in this one, a fire that hadn't been extinguished, no matter how rough its past had been. It stood there, head high despite the murmurs of mockery around it. He knew that feeling. He hesitated. This wasn't what he had come for. He had been hoping for something sturdy, dependable, something safe. But those were beyond his reach. And this? This was a gamble. The auctioneer sighed, ready to move on. Then, before he could stop himself, the farmer raised his hand. The room went silent for half a beat. Then came the murmurs, the stifled laughter. Someone called out a lazy counterbid, more as a joke than anything else. But when the farmer lifted his hand again, the room truly took notice. He wasn't playing. The seconds stretched unbearably long before the hammer finally struck. Sold. A slow wave of chuckles spread through the audience. What kind of fool would spend his hard-earned money on that? They shook their heads, already turning their attention back to the more serious bids. The real auctions. But the farmer didn't hear them. He moved forward, slipping through the sea of wealth and privilege, making his way toward the handlers who still held the horse's rope tightly, their grips tense, as if expecting another struggle. But the moment he took the lead, something strange happened. The horse stilled. It didn't fight. It didn't pull. It simply looked at him. And for the first time, he felt it, that quiet, unspoken connection between man and beast, a silent understanding written in the depths of those wild, defiant eyes. He led it away from the stage, feeling the weight of 100 amused gazes on his back. But he didn't care, because something told him this was no ordinary horse. And soon, the whole world would know it too. The walk back to his farm felt longer than usual. The dirt road stretched ahead, dust rising in soft clouds beneath his boots. The horse followed behind, its hooves dragging slightly as if it was just as unsure about this arrangement as he was. Every so often, it gave a sharp snort, ears flicking toward the distant sounds of the town behind them. He hadn't named it yet. It didn't feel right. Not yet. There was still the lingering question of whether he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The weight of the rolled-up auction receipt in his pocket pressed against his thigh, a reminder of how much he had spent. More than he could afford if he was being honest. It had taken everything he had left, and the farm still needed repairs. The fence, the feed, the tools he had been counting on, coming home with something solid, something useful. Not this. His neighbors would talk. They always did. He could already hear them, sitting on their porches, shaking their heads. Foolish, desperate, throwing away good money on a horse that looked more like it had crawled out of the wilderness than been raised for work. But deep down, something kept gnawing at him. That moment in the auction house. The way the horse had looked at him. He had seen plenty of animals in his time. Some obedient, some mean-spirited, some stubborn. But this one, it had something else. A sharpness. A depth. It wasn't just wild. It was aware. When they reached the farm, he opened the gate to the small paddock near the barn. The horse hesitated, then walked in on its own. He unclipped the lead rope, half expecting it to bolt or rear up, anything to show the fight the handlers had struggled against at the auction. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching him. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. His shoulders ached. His head throbbed. He had no energy left to question things tonight. "We'll see what you're worth in the morning," he muttered, turning away. The horse didn't make a sound as he walked back toward the house. But somehow, he could feel those eyes still on him. The next day, the real test began. The morning was crisp, the sky painted in soft hues of orange and gold. He moved through his routine as usual, feeding the chickens, checking the fences, rolling his sleeves up before stepping back toward the paddock where the horse stood waiting. The first thing he noticed was how still it was. Not nervous, not pacing. Just standing there, ears twitching slightly at the sounds of the waking farm. He grabbed a brush, stepping in carefully. The closer he got, the more he saw just how rough this horse's life had been. The coat, beneath all the dust and grime, was riddled with old scars. Thin lines running along its legs and sides, some barely noticeable, others deep enough to make him wonder just what kind of life it had lived before ending up in that auction house. Its ribs weren't as pronounced as they had seemed under the harsh lights of the auction hall, but it was still lean. Too lean. He reached out with the brush. The horse didn't flinch. That was the second strange thing. Most animals that had been through rough handling would shy away, tense up at the first touch. But this one, it stood perfectly still, like it was waiting. He ran the brush down its side, slow and steady. No reaction, no shift, no flick of the tail. Just that same watchfulness. A deep breath left his chest. Maybe this wasn't going to be the disaster he thought. By midday, he had managed to get a saddle on it. Not without effort, the first few tries had been met with stiff resistance, a deep, agitated snort, muscles tensing like coiled rope. But it never lashed out, never bucked. Just resisted, like it was testing him. The moment of truth came when he put his foot in the stirrup. He braced himself, heart pounding in his chest, fully prepared to hit the ground if this went south. He had been thrown before, more times than he could count. He knew the way a horse tensed before a bad fall, the shift in balance, the telltale flicker in its muscles before it exploded into motion. But this one, it let him up. Slowly, carefully, he settled into the saddle. His fingers tightened around the reins. The horse took a step, then another, and then it moved. Not awkward, not hesitant, not the jerky, uncertain steps of an animal still adjusting to a rider. No, this was smooth. Too smooth. His breath caught as the horse picked up pace, gliding across the paddock like it had done this 1,000 times before. Like it knew exactly what to do. A workhorse shouldn't move like this. A farm horse shouldn't feel this effortless. Something was wrong. Or maybe something was very, very right. The realization sent a chill down his spine. He pulled gently on the reins, and the horse responded instantly, shifting its weight in perfect sync with his command. It wasn't just trained. It was disciplined. Refined. This wasn't some half-wild auction reject. This was something else entirely. And as he sat there, Hands gripping the reins, wind rushing past his face, one thought burned in his mind. Where did this horse really come from? The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the paddock as he dismounted. His hands were steady, but his mind was anything but. This horse wasn't normal. He had spent years working with animals, breaking them in, training them to plow, pull, and carry. Some were stubborn, some were quick learners, but none had ever felt like this. The way it moved fluid, precise, was something he had only ever seen in high-bred racing horses or trained war mounts. Not something that should have been tossed aside at a backwater auction. He ran a hand down the horse's neck, feeling the strong muscles beneath its coat. The scars, the wary intelligence in its eyes, it had been through something. It had seen things. But what? The thought gnawed at him as he led the horse back into the barn. He had planned to put it in the open paddock, let it adjust to its new home, but something told him to keep it closed tonight. The doors creaked as he slid them shut, securing the latch. As he turned toward the house, he paused. Across the fields, near the dirt road leading to his land, a figure stood still against the fading light. Too far to make out details. Too still to be casual. He narrowed his eyes, wiping his hands on his jeans. People passed through from time to time, travelers or lost riders, but something about this sent a chill creeping up his spine. He waited, watching, but the figure didn't move. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it turned and walked away. He exhaled, shaking his head. Maybe he was just on edge. Maybe the strangeness of the day had his nerves wound too tight. But he checked the barn doors twice before heading inside. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the windows as he lay awake in bed. The house creaked, the old wood settling like it always did, but every sound felt sharper. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of the trees, the heavy silence in between. At some point, exhaustion took over. His eyes drifted shut and sleep pulled him under. Then, a sharp sound. His eyes snapped open. The barn. He threw the blanket off and grabbed the lantern by his bedside. His boots hit the floor, and before he even knew what he was doing, he was outside, his breath clouding in the cool night air. The barn doors were open. Not broken. Not forced. Just open. The lantern's glow barely cut through the darkness as he stepped inside. The scent of hay and leather filled the space, the soft flickering light casting shadows along the wooden beams. The horse was gone. His stomach twisted. He turned sharply, scanning the empty stalls, the open door, the trampled hay. Then movement. A faint shape shifting just outside. He didn't think. He ran. His boots pounded against the dirt as he rounded the barn, breath coming fast, pulse hammering in his ears. He barely caught sight of the dark figure slipping toward the tree line, leading the horse away. "Hey!" His voice cut through the night. The figure stopped. Just for a second. Then they moved fast. Whoever they were, they knew what they were doing. They didn't run blindly. They didn't panic. They mounted in one swift motion, and before he could get close enough, the horse took off. He cursed, sprinting forward, but it was useless. The night swallowed them whole. The only sound left was the wind. Whoever had taken the horse knew exactly what they were doing. The way they moved, the way they handled the animal, it wasn't a random thief looking for a quick payday. This was something else. His fists clenched. He had nothing left to lose. That horse was all he had. He rushed back to the barn, grabbed his old saddle rifle, and swung onto the only other horse he had, a slower, older mare that wasn't built for a chase. But it didn't matter. He kicked her into motion, following the faint trail left in the dirt, hoping he wasn't already too late. The night stretched on as he rode, tracking hoof prints in the moonlight, pushing the mare harder than he should have. His muscles ached, but he didn't stop. Miles passed, the trees thickening around him. Whoever had taken the horse was heading somewhere specific. Somewhere deep in the wilderness, away from roads, away from prying eyes. Then he saw it. A clearing up ahead, faint torchlight flickering through the branches. He slowed his horse, heart hammering as he crept forward. There, in the open space, stood a group of men. 4, maybe 5. Their backs were turned, their voices low as they surrounded the horse. His horse. But it wasn't tied up. It wasn't restrained. It stood there, still as stone, as if waiting. The largest of the men reached out, his hand brushing over the scars along the horse's side. His voice was sharp. "I told you it would find its way back." A shiver ran down the farmer's spine. Find its way back? He gripped the rifle tighter, stepping closer, his boots pressing into the damp earth. Another man chuckled. Took long enough. Thought it might have been too broken this time. The farmer's stomach turned. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some coincidence. This horse had belonged to them, and it had been running from them. His breath came slow and steady as he raised the rifle. His voice was hard when he finally spoke. "Step away." The group stiffened. Heads turned. Eyes narrowed. The leader let out a low, amused breath. "So, you're the one who bought it." The farmer's hands didn't shake, though his pulse roared in his ears. "That's right." The leader tilted his head, studying him. Then he looked at the horse. "You should have left well enough alone." And then the horse moved. Not away. Not toward the group, but toward him. For a second, everything hung still. The torches flickered, the wind whispered through the trees. Then, in one swift motion, the horse lunged. Not at him. At them. The leader barely had time to react before hooves struck, sending him sprawling back. The others shouted, stumbling in the sudden chaos. The farmer didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot into the air, the crack splitting through the night. The men scrambled, their confidence shattered, their advantage gone. They hadn't expected this. And neither had he. By the time they vanished into the trees, leaving only dust and panic behind, he was still standing there, staring at the horse. Breathing hard. Trying to understand. It had protected him. Not out of fear. Not out of instinct. By choice. Slowly, he reached out. His fingers brushed against its mane. The horse exhaled, steady and sure, like it had never doubted him. Like it had always known. And as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, one final thought settled deep in his chest. Who had really saved who? The men were gone. The horse was still here. And yet, something inside him felt like it had shifted forever. He ran a hand over his face, exhaustion catching up with him all at once. The rifle felt heavier in his grip now. He looked at the horse, and for the first time, he saw something more than just an animal. It had chosen to fight, to stay, to protect. He stepped closer, hesitating for just a moment before placing a firm hand against its neck. The warmth beneath his palm was steady, alive, real. The horse didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, it let out a slow breath, like some invisible tension had finally lifted. "You knew," the farmer murmured. "You knew they'd come for you." The horse didn't answer, of course, but something in its gaze told him enough. It had been running from them, maybe for a long time. And somehow, against all odds, it had ended up in his hands. Not by chance, not by luck. Something deeper than that. With a sigh, he tightened his grip on the rein. "Let's go home." The ride back was slow, the morning light creeping over the horizon, turning the sky a soft shade of gold. He stayed alert, his eyes scanning the woods, but there was no sign of the men. Not yet, at least. He didn't know if they'd come back. Didn't know if this was truly over. But for now, the fight was done. When he finally reached the farm, he led the horse into the paddock, securing the gate before stepping back, taking it all in. The barn. The house. The land that had been in his family for generations. It wasn't much, but it was his. And now, so was this horse. The realization settled deep in his chest. Whatever had happened before, whatever past this horse carried, it didn't matter now. It wasn't running anymore. It wasn't being taken. It was home. The next few days passed in a strange blur. He expected trouble. Expected to see figures standing near the tree line again. But no one came. No one called. And slowly, life returned to something close to normal. The horse settled in like it had always belonged there. It still had that watchful sharpness, that keen intelligence that told him it had been trained for more than simple farm work. But it never fought him, never resisted. If anything, it seemed at ease. The first time he rode it through the fields, he could feel the power coiled beneath the surface. This wasn't an ordinary workhorse. It moved with precision, with purpose. It responded to the slightest command as if it could read his thoughts. One evening, after a long day of fixing the fence line, an old neighbor stopped by, leaning against the wooden gate as he chewed on a piece of straw. "That the horse you picked up at the auction?" the man asked, nodding toward the animal grazing in the field. The farmer wiped the sweat from his brow, nodding. "Yeah." The old man let out a low whistle. "Heard some talk about that one. Folks say it was stolen. Taken from some big ranch out west." The farmer stiffened. "You hear who it belonged to?" The neighbor shrugged. "No names. Just that it was valuable. Real valuable." He squinted at the horse. "Looks like it's worth something, all right?" The farmer didn't respond, his mind turning over the words. Stolen. Taken. Valuable. But valuable to who? That night, he sat on his porch, staring out at the darkened fields. The horse stood near the fence, head lifted slightly, as if it sensed something too. The past was still out there, lingering like a shadow. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized something. He didn't care. Whatever had happened before, whoever had lost this horse, they hadn't come looking for it. And those men in the woods? They weren't trying to return it to some rightful owner. They were trying to take it back for themselves. For all he knew, this horse had spent its life being passed from one set of rough hands to another, treated like a tool instead of a living thing. Maybe it had been stolen. Maybe it had run. But here now, it wasn't a prize to be won. It wasn't property to be claimed. It was free. And so was he. Months passed. The farm got back on track. The repairs were slow but steady. The horse became part of his life, his land, his work. He stopped waiting for trouble, stopped looking over his shoulder. One morning, as he saddled up to ride out to the north field, he paused, running a hand down the horse's strong neck. "Guess we both got lucky that day," he muttered. The horse flicked its ears, as if it understood. And with that, they rode out together, into the open land, where nothing waited but the endless sky.